It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. The Senate has held a hearing on a topic it hasn't taken up in more than 4 decades: the president's authority to launch nuclear war. Connecticut Democrat Chris Murphy said President Trump's temperament is a cause for concern.
We are concerned that the President of the United States is so unstable, is so volatile, has a decision-making process that is so quixotic that he might order a nuclear weapons strike that is wildly out of step with U.S. national security interests.
Since taking office, Trump has repeatedly stoked tensions with nuclear-armed North Korea, threatening, quote, fire and fury, and most recently on Twitter, calling Kim Jong-un, quote, short and fat. The senators floated the possibility of rewriting laws to constrain Trump, but a panel of experts told them any such effort could backfire. Instead, General Robert Keller, former commander of the U.S. Strategic Command, said the military would ignore any illegal order to launch a nuclear weapon.
The president retains constitutional authority to order some military action. The military, you would be in a very interesting constitutional situation, I believe, because again, the military is obligated to follow legal orders, but is not obligated to follow illegal orders.
Joining me now is William Hartung, Director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. Welcome, Bill Hartung. Let's start with what we just heard from General Keller. Do you find his answer there convincing that the military would not obey an illegal order to launch a nuclear strike?
Well, I would be concerned about the short amount of time they would have to decide whether it's legal or illegal. You know, probably 5 to 15 minutes. And if the president launches a first strike, is it because we're about to be attacked? Is it because he just felt like it? That would be very hard to determine in that short amount of time. That's why there's bills in like the Markey-Lieu bill, which would, at least for a first strike, make the president consult Congress before putting millions of lives at risk. And now there's a new bill by Adam Smith, the ranking Democrat on House Armed Services, that would just blanket say, the United States will never use nuclear weapons first. So there would never be a first strike. It would not be U.S. policy. So at least with bills like those in place, there'd be some sort of a break on the president, who now basically has sole authority. I don't think Trump should have that. I don't think any president should have that.
What do you make of the fact that the Senate has held this hearing on nuclear authority for the first time since, I believe, 1976?
Well, although Senator Corker wasn't as strong as I would like in the hearings itself, his opinion is not that different from what we heard from Senator Murphy at the top of the show. So he's very concerned about this. I think Trump was sort of miffed that such a hearing is being carried out. Unfortunately, as you suggested, the witnesses were not very strong. They kind of leaned towards keeping things the way they are. They said things like, well, you know, North Korea is watching. We don't want them to think our resolve is flagging because we're discussing this. But of course, if they knew we weren't going to launch a first strike, things would be more stable. We'd be safer. They wouldn't, you know, incorrectly or by accident launch a nuclear weapon because they thought we were about to attack them. So this whole notion that the status quo is safer than the kind of changes that members of Congress and arms control peace groups are suggesting, the idea that the status quo is acceptable or somehow safer just doesn't hold water.
But the argument that you'll get back when people advocate a no first strike policy is that, well, that leaves us prone to being attacked first.
Well, the idea of deterrence, which is certainly not perfect, is that, certainly in the case of North Korea, the United States has 4,000 nuclear warheads. And if they saw a launch on the way, they would launch before the U.S. was hit. And if you're Kim Jong-un, as former Secretary of Defense William Perry has pointed out, he's a dictator, but he's not suicidal. And Perry believes he would not launch a nuclear attack against the United States unless he was under attack from the United States. So when you've got this overwhelming edge that the United States has, far more than is needed even for deterrence, I think the prospects of North Korea striking first are close to zero.
So One of the issues that we don't talk about very much when we speak about what's driving U.S. nuclear policy are the interests behind it. And you take up this topic in a recent piece for The Nation and Tom Dispatch. And your advice, just as a overall guideline to understand the issue, is to follow the money. Can you explain?
Yes. Well, ever since Eisenhower gave his military-industrial complex speech, the nuclear lobby and their allies in the military and Congress have been pressing for more nuclear weapons than we need. Eisenhower tried to block an unnecessary nuclear bomber. Then under pressure, he sort of gave it a reprieve. They campaigned on a missile gap, Kennedy did, even though there's no so much gap, and that was intelligence and military people pushing that idea to scare the American people into spending more on nuclear weapons than we need. Now we've got this $1.7 trillion nuclear modernization plan over the next 3 decades, which the Congressional Budget Office just costed. So adjusting for inflation, $1.7 trillion. That's also not needed. But General Dynamics, which makes nuclear submarines, Lockheed Martin, which makes submarine-launched ballistic missiles, Northrop Grumman, which is involved in building things like nuclear bombers, and many other companies press Congress. And in fact, if you see a debate on things like, do we need a nuclear triad, air-based, ground-based, and sea-based ways to launch nuclear weapons, a lot of times the people who come to the defense of something like ballistic missiles have ballistic missile bases in their states or a control system in their state. They've got pure pork barrel motives that they try to dress up as strategic motives. So, a lot of this excess nuclear arsenal comes from that, power and profits of these companies more so than somebody sitting down and having a rational kind of discussion about what you need to defend the country.
You mentioned that nuclear modernization program that began under President Obama. And let me ask you about one aspect of that. There was a recent study in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that said that because of the upgrades to the arsenal, even though the number of warheads may have been reduced, the lethality of the existing warheads has increased by up to 3 times. Are you aware of the study, and can you comment on what it means?
Yeah, I've heard reference to that, and I've seen the discussions. There's a couple things. There's one new nuclear weapon under construction where they can dial the yield up and down. And all of the weapons, of course, are much more powerful than, for example, the bombs that killed hundreds of thousands in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the idea of more lethal bombs just means more civilian casualties in a nuclear attack, which would already be horrific even at current levels of destruction. And the reason that we have now a nuclear weapons ban treaty at the UN is because people finally looked at the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war, which with relatively small numbers of weapons could end life as we know it on Earth, not just from the explosions, but from famine, from radiation, and so forth. So other than the countries that are the biggest nuclear powers who are holding back, the vast majority of countries in the world have finally said these things should be illegal, just like biological or chemical weapons are illegal. And I think they've put the big nuclear powers kind of on the run, both morally and politically, as a result of doing that. So that's, I think, a great achievement for global civil society.
Finally, Bill, in terms of who influences nuclear thinking in Washington, can you talk about the complex of think tanks funded by the nuclear industry, what they advocate for, and how influential they are?
Sure. We don't know the full story because it's hard to dig up these numbers, but certainly a place like the Center for Security Policy, run by Frank Gaffney, who's now a professional Islamophobe, but spent many years boosting Star Wars. He couldn't have started his think tank without money from Boeing and Lockheed and other contractors. The Lexington Institute, whose main spokesperson, Lauren Thompson, is all over the discussions in the news about these things. They are funded by major contractors. Heritage Foundation, of course, which is probably the biggest megaphone for spending more on the military, got money, for example, from Lockheed Martin when they were boosting one of their fighter aircraft, right around the time they put out a big push on that. So a lot of people don't realize that when they hear these experts, they're basically on the payroll of the contractors. So rather than the head of Lockheed Martin coming out and saying, oh, by the way, give us more money to make weapons, they have these people in think tanks making these sort of seemingly rational arguments that really are driven by special interests.
We'll leave it there. William Hartung, Director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.